Dry Creek sat like a blistered scar upon the face of the frontier, a sunburned patch of dust and splinters nestled between scorched canyons and endless plains. In the late 1800s, justice rode through these parts only on rare winds, and it seldom stayed. The town's crooked wooden buildings leaned under the weight of heat and neglect. The air tasted of dry earth and old sweat. It was the sort of place where good men left and bad ones took root. On this particular afternoon, the main street of Dry Creek buzzed with cruel anticipation. A makeshift platform had been erected beside the livery stable, its weathered boards creaking beneath the weight of livestock and misery. Townsfolk gathered in loose, restless clusters, ranch hands, drunks, widows, gamblers, all drawn by the promise of cheap stock and fresh gossip. Among the pitiful offerings was a girl. Clara stood barefoot on the platform, her pale skin smudged with dust, a faint bruise darkening one cheekbone. Her tangled hair hung in a matted curtain, hiding wary eyes that had seen too much. She was no older than 13, and beside her, tethered by a frayed rope, a lame goat shifted uneasily, its hind leg twisted and useless. The townsfolk jeered and chuckled at the sight, and someone spat into the dirt. The auctioneer was a wiry, sharp-eyed man named Jed Crowley. He thrived on misery, his voice a slick drawl that oiled the gears of Dry Creek's darker trade. Behind him, lounging near the corral fence, was the Kerrigan gang, a knot of hard, grinning men whose reputation made even the toughest ranchers lower their gaze. Led by Amos Kerrigan himself, a thick-shouldered brute with a face like sun-baked leather, the gang had long made Dry Creek their playground, dealing in stolen cattle, cards rigged with blood, and human lives when the price was right. Crowley cleared his throat and raised a hand. "Next up, we got this prime bit of frontier merchandise," he bellowed, grinning as he gestured to Clara and the goat. The laughter from the crowd swelled. A farmhand elbowed his buddy. A drunk woman cackled. "1 coin." A brittle voice called from the edge of the gathering. An old woman, stooped and dressed in threadbare gray, raised a trembling hand. Crowley's face twisted in mockery. "1 coin. For the girl or the goat, Maudie?" he sneered. "The girl." A ripple of nervous laughter followed. Kerrigan's men chuckled darkly. Amos Kerrigan stepped forward, his heavy boots kicking up dust. "Hell, Jed," he growled. "Sell her with the goat. Ain't worth the breath separate." His teeth flashed in a cruel grin. Crowley tipped his hat back, playing to the crowd. "Well now," he drawled, "who'll give me better? Anyone. Surely she's worth more'n a crippled goat and Maudie's pity." Silence. Eyes dropped. No one dared cross Kerrigan. The sheriff, a paunchy, sweat-damp man with a tin star pinned to his vest, hovered by the saloon's batwing doors, saying nothing. His hand toyed nervously with his belt, but he made no move. Clara stood still, refusing to cry, though the rope chafed her wrist raw. She had lived through worse. Then came the sound of a horse's slow, deliberate hoofbeats. A figure approached, emerging from the haze of heat and dust, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. His coat hung long and faded, the color of old earth, and his boots moved with the quiet assurance of a man long used to dangerous ground. The townsfolk fell to murmuring as he dismounted and stepped closer. Jed Crowley squinted. "Well now," he said with an uneasy laugh, "ain't that a ghost come back from the dead?" The stranger stopped before the platform. The light caught his face, lined, weathered, with eyes the color of storm clouds over dry land. Elias Granger. The name passed from lip to lip like a sudden chill. Once a frontier ranger, a man of hard justice and sharper instincts, long thought dead after vanishing years ago. Without fanfare, Elias spoke, his voice quiet, rough as worn leather. "I'll take her." Crowley blinked. "Say what now?" "The girl," Elias said. "She'll bring life to my empty home." A hush fell. Someone coughed. Kerrigan's grin vanished. He stepped forward, muscles tensing. "You're a fool, Granger. Should have stayed dead." Elias turned his gaze on Kerrigan, unreadable. "Maybe," he said, "but seeing as you ain't the law, you'll let me pay." Crowley barked a laugh to ease the tension, but glanced sideways at Kerrigan. The outlaw gave a grudging nod, though his men shifted, hands brushing gun grips. "Well, hell," Crowley drawled. If the ghost wants to waste good coin on broken goods, far be it from me. He held out a hand. Elias reached into his coat, pulled forth a single, weathered gold coin. It gleamed in the dying light, stamped with the old Republic seal. He dropped it into Crowley's palm. The weight of it seemed to tip the scales of the moment. Crowley pocketed it with a shrug. She's yours. Clara didn't move. It wasn't until Elias cut the rope from her wrist with a small, worn knife that she looked up, suspicion mingling with defiance in her eyes. He offered her a canteen. After a long pause, she took it. The crowd parted as Elias led her down from the platform. The goat hobbled after them, unbidden. Kerrigan's men watched them go, their smiles tight, already thinking of future trouble. By the time they reached Elias's horse, the sun was a molten ball skimming the ridge, and Dry Creek Street lay in heavy shadow. Without a word, Elias lifted Clara into the saddle, mounted behind her, and set the goat's rope around the saddle horn. As the horse turned toward the open land, Clara stole a glance back at the town, at the gang, the jeering faces, the life she was leaving. No one spoke. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the dusk, leaving Dry Creek with its dust, its sins, and a name spoken once again like a spark on the wind. Elias Granger had come home. The sun hung low by the time Elias Granger's homestead came into view. A battered cabin crouched at the edge of a narrow canyon where the land fell away into deep ravines and wind-carved stone. The place looked as though it had stood for 100 hard seasons, its walls weathered gray by sun and dust, the porch sagging in places, the windows clouded with grit. Behind it, an old windmill clattered lazily in the hot breeze, its blades rusted but stubbornly spinning. To most eyes, it was a forsaken place, a relic swallowed by the land's cruel appetite. But to Elias, it was home, the only thing he hadn't buried. Clara sat stiffly in the saddle as the horse picked its way up the narrow path. She hadn't spoken much since Dry Creek, only answering in nods or the rare one-word murmur. The goat, limping along behind, kept close, its ears flicking at every sound. Elias cast a glance back at them now and again, measuring the girl's silence, the haunted look behind her dust-smudged face. He dismounted before the porch and lifted Clara down, without a word. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. He pointed toward the door. "Inside," he said. His voice was rough, carrying the weight of a man who'd spent too long talking to no one but the wind. The cabin's interior was dim, lit only by what remained of the sinking light, slipping through gaps in the shutters. The air smelled of dry wood, leather, and something long untended. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold. A battered table sat under a single oil lamp, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The floor was swept but scarred by age. Elias moved to a cupboard, pulling down a tin of beans and a small loaf of hard bread. He filled a pot with water from a barrel and set it on the stove, without lighting it. Clara stood just inside the door, her hand gripping the goat's rope, eyes darting from the gun rack on the wall to the worn boots by the hearth. "You eat," Elias said, pointing to a stool. "Then sleep. Nothing'll harm you here." Clara didn't move. It took the scent of the warming beans for her to shuffle forward. She sat, the goat curling beside her feet, its chin resting on her knee. When the food came, Clara ate with careful, quiet bites, not daring to take too much, though her hunger was plain. Elias didn't join her, choosing instead to lean against the doorframe, watching the canyon beyond as dusk thickened. The years hung heavy in that house. Dust-covered shelves cluttered with old maps, rusted tools, a stack of yellowed newspapers. A scatter of faded wanted posters curled at the edges near a shelf lined with cracked jars. An old rifle lay across a pair of mounted antlers, its barrel smudged but cared for. Above the fireplace, a framed photograph sat askew, a woman with kind, plain features, her hair pinned back, a boy of maybe 8 with the same sharp eyes as Elias. Time had faded the image, but it still spoke. Clara's gaze lingered there a moment, then dropped. When she'd eaten, Elias led her to a small room at the back. It held a narrow bed covered in a patched quilt and a simple wooden dresser. The window was shuttered but not locked. "You stay in here," he said. "Door's yours to bolt." She hesitated before speaking, her voice dry and hoarse from dust and silence. "Why?" He looked at her, and for a long moment, the lines in his face deepened. "World's got its own rules. You'll be safer here than out there." Clara nodded, barely. She set the goat at the foot of the bed and lay down without removing her boots, staring at the low ceiling. Elias left the door ajar and went back to the fire, setting another log even though the night remained warm. Over the next days, the rhythm of the place settled around them. Clara remained wary, keeping to corners and moving quiet as a shadow. But she cleaned, scrubbing grime from the windows and sweeping dust from the corners. She found a box of old curtains in a trunk and stitched the tiers, hanging them herself. In the small patch of dry earth behind the cabin, she dug shallow furrows and planted a handful of seeds from a pouch she'd hidden beneath her dress: sunflower, beans, and squash. Elias said nothing of it, but left her to it. He spent the days fixing fence posts and checking traps. A man of few words, his presence filled the cabin like a low, steady hum. In the evenings, Clara would find coffee already made or a pair of mended shoes set by the door. She began leaving a cup ready by the stove in the mornings. It was old Silas who first carried word of trouble. The one-armed rancher rode up on his mule as Elias was mending a gate. "Heard Kerrigan's boys ain't too pleased, Granger," Silas rasped, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Word is, Amos didn't take kindly to you shaming him in front of Dry Creek." Elias only grunted. Silas eyed the canyon walls. "Ain't the first time they've taken a score to heart. You know what they did to the Tolly place." Elias nodded. "I know. Be ready." After the old man left, Elias sharpened his knives and set the rifle in easy reach beside the door. One evening, as Clara swept near the hearth, her foot struck a loose board. Curiosity got the better of her. Kneeling, she pried it up and found a narrow cavity beneath. Inside lay a small, tarnished badge, the 5-pointed star of a frontier ranger, worn thin by years. Beside it, a leather-bound journal, the cover cracked and brittle. In the flicker of firelight, she turned its pages, reading lines scrawled in a steady, plain hand. Names, places, tallies of men brought in or left buried in the earth. And then, near the middle, a name repeated more than any other: Kerrigan. The entries darkened as they went, shifting from reports of arrests to bitter laments. Mentions of a family murdered, a wife named Ada, a boy called Seth, and a single word written heavy in the margins beside Kerrigan's name: justice. She replaced the journal before Elias returned, but not before the truth took root. Elias's past lingered in every corner of that place, in the worn tools, the photographs, and the ache that settled in his eyes when the wind stirred the empty bedchamber where a child had once slept. That night, Elias brought out a small revolver, the handle smooth from use. "Know how to shoot?" he asked Clara. She shook her head. He loaded it, handed it to her. "You'll learn." They stepped into the cooling night, the canyon walls painted in shades of red and violet. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to line the sights. She listened, every lesson a small anchor in the shifting dust of her life. The first shot cracked the silence. Hazel bleated. Clara's aim was wide, but her hand steady. "Good," Elias said. "Again." The sun dipped behind the cliffs, shadows creeping long and deep. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped. The land held its breath. Justice had begun to stir. Word didn't travel fast in Dry Creek. It moved like a snake through grass, unseen but always there, and by the time Elias Granger finished mending his fence line that morning, he could feel it in the air. Trouble was coming. The wind shifted, carrying whispers from the saloon porch, from behind shuttered windows, from tight-lipped ranchers who wouldn't meet his eye. By sundown, it would have a name. Amos Kerrigan, pride thick as molasses and twice as dangerous, had heard about the auction. Word that the ghost ranger had stepped out of whatever grave folks had put him in and laid claim to the girl right under Kerrigan's nose. In Dry Creek, a man didn't keep hold of power by letting old ghosts defy him. Amos meant to settle the matter, not in backrooms or whispered threats, but in daylight, where everyone could see and remember who ruled the dust-blown streets of their miserable town. By noon, Kerrigan called for 3 of his meanest dogs, Clem Duggan, broad as a freight wagon with a temper to match, Wade Skern, thin and slick as a gutshot snake, and Lenny Pike, a wiry killer with a nervous twitch and a love for hurting things that couldn't fight back. Amos gave them simple orders. Ride up to Granger's place. Drag him out. Bring the girl. Alive if it worked out that way. If not, leave what was left for the buzzards. They left Dry Creek before the sun reached its highest point, the townsfolk pretending not to watch them go. A cloud of dust followed their horses, trailing toward the canyons, where the land curled in on itself, and bad men vanished. But Elias Granger wasn't one for waiting. He caught the scent of it in the way old Silas rode past that morning, eyes narrowed, the barest shake of his head, in the silence of the hills, in how even the birds seemed quiet. There were signs in every corner of this land, and Elias had learned long ago to read them. By mid-afternoon, he had Clara pack what little she owned, the seed pouch, the worn quilt, the small revolver he'd shown her how to hold but never yet fire. Hazel, the lame goat, followed without needing a rope. Red Bluff Pass lay 5 miles east, a narrow stretch of canyon where the cliffs closed in like jaws and the lights slanted sharp as knives. Elias knew it better than any man alive. He'd made his name laying traps for worse than Kerrigan in those shadows. If trouble was coming, it would die there. The girl rode Hazel's old rope around the saddle horn, her face pale but steady. Elias didn't waste words on comfort. The time for soft things had passed. When they reached the pass, Elias led them to a shaded alcove near a cluster of scrub pines. A trickling creek ran nearby, its narrow banks thick with reeds and dry grass, good for hiding. He knelt before Clara, his voice low. "You stay here," he told her. "Keep low. If they come, don't run till you have to." Clara swallowed hard. "And you?" "I'll be waiting." He left her there with a canteen, the revolver in her lap, and Hazel grazing nearby. Then he moved into the pass, vanishing among the rocks like a ghost. Elias worked quickly. He rigged tripwires between narrow ledges, where a careless boot would send stones tumbling loud as gunshots. He loosened boulders above choke points, placed sharp stakes in shaded hollows. He marked a high ridge where the sun hit longest, a perfect spot for a rifleman. From a hidden cache beneath an ancient juniper, he retrieved the old Winchester rifle, its stock worn smooth, the barrel oiled and clean. Widowmaker, he'd called it, back when his badge was bright and his enemies plentiful. He loaded it with steady hands, feeling the years fall away with each shell. By dusk, the sky bled orange across the canyon rim. Long shadows reached down like grasping fingers. They came as he knew they would, riding hard, overconfident. Clem's voice boomed ahead of them, cursing the dust. Wade chuckled like a man already drunk on victory, and Lenny spat every few feet. Elias lay prone along the ridge, Widowmaker steady in his hands. He waited until the first trigger point. Clem's horse kicked a wire, sending a rain of pebbles clattering from the cliffs. The big man cursed and wheeled around, but the sound had already drawn them deeper. Elias lined up a shot. The rifle cracked once. A puff of red mist bloomed from Lenny Pike's chest, and the outlaw toppled backward, his eyes still wide in shock as he hit the ground. Chaos broke loose. Clem roared, drawing his gun, while Wade kicked his horse hard toward the creek. Another pull of Elias's trigger sent a shot whistling past Wade's head, close enough to split his hat brim. The outlaw ducked low, spurring his mount into cover. But Clem was too stubborn for sense. He dismounted, shouting curses, and started for the rocks. "Come out, Granger. I'll skin you alive, you old ghost." Elias didn't answer. A well-placed shove of his boot dislodged a waiting boulder. It crashed down the slope, slamming into Clem's leg. The big man howled, crumpling to the dirt. The rifle was nearly empty now, and Elias moved like a shadow through the rocks, circling toward the creek where Wade had disappeared. Down by the water, Clara heard the shouting. Hazel bleated nervously. She gripped the revolver tight, every heartbeat a hammer in her chest. And then Clem was there, dragging himself through the reeds, a mad gleam in his eyes, his teeth red with blood. "Got you now, little girl," he rasped. Clara raised the revolver, hands trembling. He lunged. The shot cracked, missing his chest but catching his shoulder. Clem spun back, cursing, and before he could recover, Clara scrambled away, Hazel bolting after her. Elias arrived moments later, his knife glinting in the dusk. Clem swung a rock, but the old ranger was faster. A sharp movement, a blur of motion, and Clem Duggan lay still beside the creek. Wade Skern made his stand higher up the pass, pinned behind a boulder. Elias climbed toward him, using gullies and cover. The gunfight was close, ugly, Wade's shot sparking off stone, Elias's knife flashing in the half-light. They grappled, fists and grit and curses, and in the end it was terrain that decided it. A feint, a shove, and Wade tumbled from the ledge, striking the canyon floor hard enough to leave him unmoving. By the time silence fell, the sun had vanished, leaving the pass to night's cool embrace. Clara emerged from the shadows, face streaked with dirt and fear. She approached Elias, revolver limp in her grip. "I shot him," she whispered. Elias took the gun, checked the cylinder. "Good," he said quietly. "You lived." They buried the bodies in a dry wash. No headstones, no prayers. On the ride home, Clara rode in front of him, the night full of crickets and ghost voices. Near the cabin, she spoke, haltingly. "There's something," she said, pulling a small locket from inside her dress. She opened it, revealing a faded picture, a young woman with dark hair, a steady gaze. Elias's hand closed on the reins, his breath catching. "I've seen her," he said hoarsely. "That's my sister." Clara looked up at him, tears cutting through the dust on her face. "She was my ma." For a moment, neither spoke, the canyon wind the only witness. Elias reached out, brushing Clara's hair back from her cheek, his hand rough but gentle. "Then you're mine, girl," he said, voice thick. "Blood of my blood." And the last empty piece of the old ranger's heart, long thought buried with his past, began to stir. The wind carried the story long before any writer did. In Dry Creek and the outlying ranches, in the mining camps and scattered shanties of the canyon rim, folks whispered of the old ranger. Elias Granger, the ghost come back, stalking the canyons like a revenant. And now, Kerrigan's men were dying. They spoke of Lenny Pike found dead by Red Bluff's creek, of Clem Duggan's shattered body left for coyotes, and of Wade Skern's broken neck beneath Widow's Ridge. The name Elias Granger hadn't been spoken in years, but now it moved on every tongue, soft and reverent, like the return of something wild and right. Word reached Kerrigan by dawn. Inside the saloon, the outlaw king of Dry Creek smashed a whiskey bottle against the wall, his face dark with rage. Amos Kerrigan wasn't the sort to lose men. Not like this. Not to an old ghost with a long-forgotten badge and a girl at his side. The gang watched him from the shadows, the bravado drained from their faces, knowing what came next. "He wants war," Kerrigan spat, voice low and mean. "Then, by God, we'll bring it to his doorstep." By midday, Kerrigan had gathered the full measure of his gang, a hard-eyed dozen murderers, thieves, old war deserters, with nothing left but the coin Kerrigan gave them. They strapped on fresh guns, loaded heavy, and rode out like wolves scenting blood. But Elias Granger was no longer a man running from ghosts. He was a man chasing them. At his cabin, Elias stood before a battered trunk he hadn't touched in over a decade. He opened it with steady hands, the hinges groaning like old bones. Inside lay his ranger's coat, faded but intact, the badge still pinned above the heart. He ran his hand over it, fingers tracing the old star, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. He buckled on his belt, slid Widowmaker's sling over his shoulder, and stepped out into the sun. Old Silas was waiting by the corral, his one arm steady on the saddle horn. Behind him stood a handful of others, lean ranchers, old miners, a young cowhand no older than 16 gripping a scattergun in white-knuckled fists. Faces worn by dust and hard winters. Men and women Dry Creek had forgotten. Clara stood among them, pale but unshaken, Hazel the goat trotting at her heels. "You come to die, boys?" Elias asked them quietly. Silas spat in the dust. "Come to kill, Granger. Tired of watching Kerrigan bleed this land dry." A murmur of agreement passed through the little band. No one cheered. No one smiled. But they stayed. Elias nodded, his voice like dry stone. Then listen close. He led them up through the winding gullies and narrow trails to the place the land itself favored, Widow's Gap, a stretch of canyon where the cliffs narrowed so tight a man could spit from one side to the other. It was there years ago. Elias had made his bones trapping outlaws and deserters. Numbers meant nothing in the gap. A man's courage did. At the canyon's edge, Elias spoke to them, his words plain and sharp. "This place has known more blood than water," he said. "But it's ours now. You've spent years bowing to a gang of cowards and killers. That ends today. They'll ride in thinking we're rabbits, easy pickings. What they'll find is wolves." He rested a hand on Clara's shoulder. "This one's family to me," he added. "But she's family to this land too. I aim to see her live free, and any man rides with me does the same for his own." The men nodded, some spitting, others muttering a wordless agreement. Clara lifted her chin, her voice steady. "We ain't running." Silas grinned, showing a broken tooth. "Damn right, girl." They worked quickly, setting traps the way Elias taught them. Tripwires strung low, rocks braced to fall, narrow crossings marked for ambush. The few rifles they had were loaded and placed in high crags. A scatter of crude dynamite sticks from the old mining camp were buried under shale where horses would stumble. Elias posted Clara near the north ridge, a revolver in her hand and a pair of lookout boys nearby. She didn't protest. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of rust. The sun slung low behind the western cliffs. Heat shimmered off the stone like smoke, and the land held its breath. And then came the riders. Kerrigan's gang stormed down the trail like a pack of wolves drunk on their own legend, dust churning in their wake. They laughed and cursed, their guns strapped high. Kerrigan at their head on a black gelding, his mouth set in a hard line. The last of the sun caught their figures in sharp relief, painting them blood-red against the canyon walls. They didn't slow. Kerrigan raised a hand, signaling his men forward. The canyon swallowed them whole. On the ridge, Clara gripped her revolver, so tight her knuckles whitened, but she held her ground. Below, Elias crouched behind a cluster of boulders, Widowmaker steady in his grip. They were coming, and by God, they'd learn what it was to bleed in a land built for ghosts. The first of Kerrigan's riders poured into Widow's Gap, just as the sun dropped behind the canyon rim, the light turning the world a bruised, dusky red. The cliffs closed tight around them, the walls high and unforgiving, and the ground narrowed to a rocky corridor no more than 20 paces wide. It should have been a killing ground, and it would be. Elias Granger lay flat atop a ledge, Widowmaker steady in his hands, his old eyes calm as glass. He waited until the last rider cleared the narrow bend, Kerrigan's black gelding at the center. The outlaws face a mask of rage and certainty. They thought themselves unstoppable. Elias knew better. He gave the signal, a sharp whistle, rising like a hawk's cry. Rocks tumbled first, a sudden clatter as a boulder toppled from above, striking the lead rider's mount. The beast screamed, pitching sideways. Gunfire snapped through the narrowing dusk as Elias's makeshift militia opened up from both sides, bullets ricocheting off stone and cutting down men where they rode. Chaos. The gang scattered, firing wildly. Men tried to turn their horses, but the tight canyon walls turned their numbers into a trap. A second rockfall collapsed behind them, closing off the escape. Dust thickened the air. Horses reared and screamed, and over it all, Widowmaker spoke. Each shot a clean, deadly punctuation in the uproar. Elias moved like a man half his years, shifting from rock to rock, laying down fire, calling sharp orders. He shot a man from his saddle with a single crack of the rifle, then dropped another who crouched behind a boulder, thinking it safe. Every shot counted. Every movement was deliberate. The canyon was his ally, its twists and ridges laid into his bones long ago. On the northern ridge, Clara knelt with the revolver, her heart pounding like a hammer. She saw old Silas go down, a shot catching him in the leg as he reloaded by a leaning pine. Without thinking, she scrambled down the slope, ducking low as bullets hissed overhead. "Stay back!" Silas barked, pain contorting his face. But Clara grabbed a fallen rifle, the wood warm from another man's hands, and rolled behind a boulder. She lifted it awkwardly, braced against the rock, and fired. The shot went wide. She gritted her teeth, steadied, and fired again. This time, one of Kerrigan's men jerked backward with a shout. "Atta girl," Silas grunted. Further down the slope, Hazel the goat panicked at the din, bolting along the rocky path. The little beast stumbled against a loose stone the size of a hog's head. It teetered, then fell. The boulder slammed into a stack of smaller rocks, dislodging them in a sudden cascade. A rock slide thundered down the canyon wall, crashing into the trail where two outlaws rode. One was crushed beneath the fall, the other thrown from his horse. More stones followed, clogging the narrow exit path behind Kerrigan's riders. The outlaws' retreat was cut. Elias saw the moment. He shouldered Widowmaker and slid down the slope, boots sure on the loose shale. Gunfire slowed, scattered into desperate shots. The gang was breaking. Amos Kerrigan dismounted at the canyon's heart, rage and bloodlust burning in his eyes. He drew a heavy revolver and fired twice at Elias, missing high. "You old bastard!" Kerrigan roared. "Should have stayed in the dirt." Elias said nothing. He tossed aside his empty rifle, drew his knife, and stalked forward. They met in the dust, two old wolves, with too much bad blood between them for words. Kerrigan struck first, a brutal hook that caught Elias's jaw. Elias staggered, tasting iron, but swung back with a savage punch to Kerrigan's ribs. The bigger man grunted, slashing with his knife, grazing Elias's arm. They circled, fists and blades flashing in the dying light, the battle fading to a ring of gun smoke and dust around them. "You're too old for this," Kerrigan spat, his teeth red. Elias smirked, blood running down his chin. "Not to finish you." Kerrigan lunged. Elias twisted, catching the outlaw's wrist, the two men grappling like beasts. A blow to the gut drove the air from Elias's lungs, but he twisted a boot against a rock, pivoted, and slammed Kerrigan's head against the canyon wall. Dazed, Kerrigan staggered. Elias struck again, driving his fist into the outlaw's throat, dropping him to his knees. From his boot, Elias drew a small, worn knife, a relic he'd carried since his first kill as a ranger. Without hesitation, he drove it into Kerrigan's heart. The outlaw king gasped, his mouth working for words, then toppled into the dust. Silence swept the canyon. The surviving outlaws, leaderless, bloodied, and cornered, dropped their weapons one by one. A few fled into the narrow gaps between the stones, but most knew the fight was done. Elias stood over Kerrigan's body, chest heaving. Clara ran to his side, dirt-streaked and wide-eyed, the rifle still in her grip. "It's over," she asked. Elias looked at her, then around the canyon. The sun was gone, but the sky still burned with the last light. "Yeah," he said. "It's over." By dawn, word had reached Dry Creek. The sheriff had vanished, the saloon emptied of Kerrigan's loyalists. The townfolk began to crawl from their silence, offering awkward thanks, tight nods, and wary respect. A reckoning had come and gone, and the ghost of Elias Granger walked among them again, not as a myth, but as a man. At the homestead, the cabin's hearth burned steady for the first time in years. Clara cleared the old photographs from the mantel and placed a new one, of her, Elias, and Hazel standing before the sun-warmed porch. Some nights, the wind still whispered past Widow's Gap, carrying old voices, but they were quieter now. Justice had been done, and as Elias would later tell Clara, sitting beside that same fire, "Some homes ain't built of wood and stone, girl. They're built of hearts willing to fight for what's right." And this one, at last, was whole again.